So, my name's Paul Heald. I work for Sigma Systems, and for the past 2.5 years, Sigma Systems and Kuali Student have been working together to produce the student accounting module of Kuali Student Accounts. Kuali Student, sorry. I'm just going to go straight into a presentation, a quick slide deck about Kuali Student Accounts, and then I'll give you a demo of the system at the end of that. So, without further ado, my name's Paul Heald. I'm the systems architect of Kuali Student Accounts, and Kuali Student Accounts is a baseline student accounts receivable package, and it came into being when Sigma, who is a commercial vendor, working with some of our clients, were informed by a lot of our clients that they have problems with the current student accounting systems. And many years ago, Sigma used to have a proprietary system for student accounts receivable that we ceased maintaining because we were concentrating more on financial aid. We worked with the University of Maryland and the University of Southern California to come up with a baseline group of things they needed to be able to do within an account receivable package for students. So when we went through all our functional requirements gathering, we came up with these modules that made up the whole suite, or the baseline suite, of Kuali Student Accounts. Most of Kuali products are 3 or 4 letters long, or 5 letters long, just to make ourselves special. We've got KSA CA, which is core accounting, which deals with payments, charges, all that accounting type stuff. We've got KSA fee management, which deals with essentially students signing up for courses and being charged for those courses, tuition, fees, all that kind of stuff. Payment billing, which is the ability to take a student's account and finance it over several different payments, so payment plans. KSA third party, which is KSA TP, which handles taking a student's account and transferring certain charges over to a third party sponsor, such as an employer, anything where somebody else is taking charge of the payment of a part of a student account. We have KSA BP, which is bill production, which is the ability, obviously, to take payments, charges, etc., out of the system and present them to the student, either in the form of a PDF statement or as a billing statement that gets mailed to the student, or any other method that you actually want to communicate that to a student. KSA payment application, which is really a special part of the system that I'll go into a little bit more detail in this presentation, which is the ability to map certain payments that have been made on the system to certain charges on the system. We have KSA refund management, which is obviously the ability to take money out of the system and give it back to the person who has paid it into your system. And then KSA reporting and reconciliation, which is a reporting system and also maintains the connection to the general ledger. So as a kind of high-level view of the system, the core accounting system sits at the middle of the system. That deals with everything from basically anything where a student account gets a transaction placed on it. We then have a number of process modules that interact with that core accounting system. That's your third-party system, your payment billing system, your bill production, your payment application, your refund management, and your reporting and reconciliation. We have several support modules that don't really affect the accounting of the system, but really assist the user. A smaller collections module that assigns students and records which collections agency they may have been assigned to. A memo-based or a CRM-type system that lets you keep information on the student account. And then obviously the user experience that the user connects to the system through. Outside of the system, we foresee integrating with a number of different input systems, one of which is a tuition charging system, which is actually part of KSA. It's KSA fee management. But we really don't see that as part of the core accounting system, rather the link to Kuali enrollment. So we kind of put it slightly outside of the system. The system will integrate with a cashiering system, a financial aid system. If you have other vendors on your campus, so your library may feed fines and things into the system. Your housing system may have to feed charges into the system. A lot of schools have a parking system that would require parking fees to be paid through the system. You may have some kind of external portal for your students that could connect to this system. And the whole system relies on identity management, which is KIM out of the box, so you can integrate with your campus-wide identity system. We export all general ledger transactions out to obviously whatever general ledger you're using. By default, we integrate with KFS out of the box. We've been testing the export from KSA to Maryland's implementation of KFS, and that's been successful. So out of the box, the system can export its financial transactions out to KFS. Finally, you've got your system integrating with, a user integrating with the whole system through the web browser via the user experience to get access to all this functionality. So from the outset, what KSA sought to do is a number of things. A lot of things that schools are currently outsourcing, in theory, can be handled by KSA. Things like payment billing or third-party plans are quite commonly in the US outsourced to other companies who deal with those problems for the schools. We provided a baseline way of handling those functions within KSA, so if you wanted to, you could bring those processes back home. Another big part of KSA was to handle really some of the complexities of US financial aid, and really spans both the educational side of the school as well as the financial side of the school. And even though you might not be looking at US financial aid in South Africa, you probably have a lot of use cases that are very similar to the way that we handle the payment application within KSA. Also, the ability to handle refunds, including limited fund refunds, which again is part of this US financial aid problem. We wanted the system to integrate directly with KFS out of the box. Some of the reporting requirements for higher education in the US are quite complex, so we wanted to be able to have a way of handling those within KSA. We specifically designed that in a way that, even though our use cases were to produce basically US tax forms and so on, it was done in such a way that it was a very, very flexible reporting system that would let you pull out information to go onto any kind of reporting form. So it wouldn't just be limited to the US tax forms that we've currently got set up in the system. And we wanted to automate a lot of the complex tasks that go on within student accounting. I've already mentioned payment application before, but to kind of use our Kuali metaphor, we've got our Kuali, we've got KSA, which is the tofu of the dish, if you like, and payment application really is the special sauce of the system. It's really what makes this accounting system different to most other accounting systems, especially for students. It's the way in which you can relate these charges to these payments in a limited way, which generally isn't too useful in a lot of other accounting systems, but really makes a big difference in the US, again, because of this financial aid problem. Payment application is a rule-based system. We have a natural language system that defines your institutional rules. And then we have a table-based setup of our priorities, the hierarchy of our payments and our charges, and which payments are allowed to pay which charges. So we've really kind of divided the line between the simple setup of your charges and your payments that define that hierarchy, followed by a really fine-grained ability to define how that actually happens with your payment application at the point of using it. The system is able to reapply payments when your rules or your situations change, and you can always override the system by doing a manual allocation. So you can say, okay, the system may define this payment as going to this charge, but in this one instance, we're going to override the system and make this allocation manually. So our examples of payment application, obviously I've mentioned it several times. US financial aid, you're only allowed to use that to pay educational expenses. So if a student gets a parking ticket, you may have $15,000 of US financial aid on the account, but you can't pay that parking ticket with it. And you can only pay tuition and certain other limited charges. You may have a book award that's given within your institution that can only be used to pay charges from the bookstore, and again, couldn't pay that nefarious parking ticket. You may have departmental awards that can only be used to pay certain departmental fees. So that's really the main use cases of payment application, is that limited fund ability to make sure that the important charges are paid first and the right funds are applied to the right charges. So just a kind of graphical example of payment application, you may have, again, this $15,000 worth of financial aid that you can see in the middle of the screen. The student account has tuition, books, parking tickets, and a fee and some fees on it. Even though there is a parking ticket on the account that's $50, that cannot be paid by US financial aid, leaving the financial aid with a credit balance of $1,800. We can also use this manual payment application system. So you may have an institutional rule that says pay tuition first. So if the student walks into your office with $50 to pay off that parking ticket, your automated payment application may say, well, I've got $50. I'm going to apply that to tuition. So it will pay off that first $50 of that $10,000 tuition charge. Manual payment application lets the cashier go in and say, no, this $50 is to pay off this parking ticket, and then that parking ticket would then be considered paid. The system also handles third-party plans. The use case for this would be a large company who says that for all their employees, they'll make payments for those students. In order for this system to work, we have a whole transfer transaction system, which is a highly automated way of taking transactions from one account and applying them to another account. Because the system's so highly audited, those transactions can also be completely reversed. So in the example of a third-party account, if a employer makes an agreement to pay for a student and those charges are transferred off to that employer's account, and then that student leaves that employer, you would be able to reverse out that third-party account and put the account back into the same situation it was before the third-party transactions had gone into effect. A symbol for that in the system, just so that when you see the system, you know what it is. We couldn't come up with a good system icon for third-party, so we made a third-party hat. So when you see something on the screen that looks like a little cone, that's our third-party system. I'll show you that when I get into the live system a little more. So an example may be that you have a student. Obviously, they have tuition, they have a books fee, and they have and the employer has said they'll pay $10,000 worth of the student's tuition. They'll pay some third-party charges, and they'll pay some level of book fees. That goes through our transaction transfer system. It's reversed off the student's account, and it's applied to the employer account or the third-party account. The payment billing system, which is a little pie chart on the screen that you'll see, basically allows you to take a subset of transactions on the student's account and finance them over future days. So you may have a system where you say, okay, you're allowed to take your tuition charges and pay them over 6 months, and you can set up a plan that will take those only tuition charges and make them payable on certain days. You can obviously bring in other charges if you wanted to. You could make it tuition and fees. You could make it tuition fees and bookstore charges. You could make your bookstore charges only divide into 2 payments. It's a very flexible system to be able to basically finance out students' responsibilities to the student account. You can make the system reverse if the student becomes incompliant with the system, and again, it goes through this transaction transfer system, so everything it does is audited and is able to be reversed. The refund management system relies on that payment application system that I mentioned to you before. Again, with these US federal financial aid rules, we've got a rather complicated system of what it means to have to give a student a refund. You can end up in a situation in the US whereby there may be $20,000 worth of financial aid on the account and $30,000 of charges, but if you're not allowed to apply that financial aid to those charges, you actually have to write the student a check. And you may actually be in a situation where you're writing the student a check for $10,000, even though the student owes you $15,000. So the refund management system of KSA is based on this use case of you can't just look at whether or not the student's overpaid. We actually have to work out whether or not the student's overpaid, and is the student allowed to use those payments to pay off those charges. So again, that relies on that payment application system that I'll show you later on in the actual live demo. The refund system goes through a few different steps. You have payments that have unallocated balances. That means it's not been touched by the payment application system. It goes through a refund request system. We have a lot of logic built into the system to say, has the payment been cleared? You can set clearing dates on your payments. You may have longer clearing periods for checks than you do for credit cards. Obviously, very short period, zero clearing period for cash. You can set payment types to be refundable or not refundable. And if they are refundable, you can attach a refund rule to them that lets you handle situations such as if it's a credit card, maybe you don't refund within the first 5 days because it may still be reversed on you. And then for the next 45 days, you would issue a refund back to a credit card. And then after 45 days, you may just issue a refund as a check. All that's built into the logic of KSA when you set up your actual transaction or payment types. This runs through a system where you create unverified refunds, so the system looks for refundable objects on the system. Then a person can go through a verification process and say, okay, we agree this is being refunded. You can automate part of that process to say, okay, this is obviously a cash payment. It obviously has to go back to the student. Let's just refund this. And then the actual refund transactions are created and you can send the check out back to the student. So it's a very kind of methodical system for issuing refunds to students if that's something that you need to be able to do. All communication into and out of KSA is done as XML. So the billing statements at this point come out of the system basically as an XML file that can then be processed in any way that you want to process. So we zip up everything into an XML file. You may have a billing statement that looks something like this, and then everything just kind of gets put into the right place as part of a billing statement. You could present that to the student as a PDF, you could present it as a printed document, you could email it to the student. However you currently run your bill presentment to the students, we will be able to support that within KSA. The fee management system is the integration point with the upcoming Kuali student registration system. There's a rate service that sits between both Kuali Student and Kuali Student Accounts that defines essentially what your pricing is and how your pricing works. And Kuali Student will then send that pricing information over to KSA. KSA has, again, a flexible rule-based system using natural language rules that can work out whether that student's eligible for charges, if the student has to be recharged for something, if there's a discount to be applied, other activity or enrollment fees to be applied to that student, choosing regular course fees, tuition, and anything else that might be based on the status of the student. So, you may offer a discount to students who have early registered, or you may apply a late fee if the student registers after a certain date. That's all handled by fee management natural language rule system. Other features of KSA, there's a rule-based blocking system. So based on the status of the student, you may refuse to accept certain types of charges on the student's account. So maybe if they have not made a payment in the last 90 days on their account, you may block all charges to their account except for perhaps tuition. If the student has previously bounced a check to you, you may choose not to accept checks from them for maybe a year. You could do that based on student status. So you may say an undergraduate gets to bounce one check, but a graduate gets to bounce two checks. Again, that's all done through a rule-based system. You're able to lock transaction types to certain users. So for example, you may allow your English department to access a system and post charges to a student's account, but only allow them to use certain charge codes. So for example, there may be a certain fee that you allow them to manually assess onto the student's account. So you just give the English department access to that single code or number of codes. There's a memo system, an alert system, which I'll be able to show you in the system, which allows the administrative user to keep notes on the student account and communicate with anybody else looking at that account. That can obviously be turned off by user, and you can actually also categorize the types of memo in the system and make those memos only viewable by certain types of users. So you may have a bursar level of memo and a cashier level of memo, and the cashiers can't see the bursar level of memo. The system also can produce reports for governmental reporting. Here in the US, we have to report on a form called a 1098-T anything that the student has paid in tuition and eligible fees, and that is then used as a tax write-off. But that information also has to be provided to the federal government. That's all done by a tag-based system inside KSA that I can show you that lets you select out certain types of charges and certain types of payments, which makes reporting a lot easier. Obviously, we directly integrate with KFS, so all of our general ledger charges are exported straight to KFS. The system's very, very highly audited. Pretty much anything that changes in KSA is recorded. So if anything from a change in name to a reversal of a transaction, every single time anything changes in KSA, we record the fact that that's happened, we record what it was and what it changed to. Everything that goes in and out of the system is an XML, so it's very flexible. and very easy to code against the system. And the data model is very well documented, so it's very easy to write reports directly against KSA. I have an example of that to just show you the aged bill process is just a very simple system to pull the data straight from KSA to present that report to an end user. Okay, so this is the system. We have a very simple navigation system. We have a top-level navigation across the top, and then side navigation based on what part of the system that you've gone into. No matter what screen you're on, there's always the account lookup at the top of the screen that allows you to get into a student account. So if you're dealing face-to-face with a student, no matter where you are in the system, you can always get to the account lookup to find the student that you want to deal with. The search is flexible. Right now we've got the system set to search on user ID, last name, zip code, parts of address, parts of names. So you can just type in a partial name and it will give you a list of all the accounts in the system with that as part of the name. You could use the zip code or the postcode. You could use partial last name or full last name. And then once you do that search, you get given a little more information about the student to help you accurately select the right student that you want to go into. Once you find the student that you want to deal with, you're given 3 ways of looking at a student. And obviously you could switch off any one of these accesses for different users. So you may want to drive cashiers through one view, whereas you want to drive your second line staff through a different way of looking at the student account. I'm going to look first of all at the quick view on a student, and the quick view of a student is kind of the dashboard view of a student. So I'm going to choose my user 1 and come up with the quick view for them. So this is an overview of what's on the student account, and this may be the only view that you gave some of your users. For example, you may want to give departmental access to just the quick view for students. At the top of the screen, we see the student's name and their user identifier, and then a lot of other information is kind of crammed into this top line. Here we have the alert system that shows us that there are 6 alerts registered against this student. Alerts and memos are very, very similar to each other, except that alerts are designed to kind of be the top line information on a student. So you may have a student who has done something and your second line staff want to see them. So as soon as your cashier staff pull up a student's account, the first thing they would see would be an alert on the student saying, hey, send this person to Betty. She needs to deal with him right now. So that's the alert system. And on any account, you'll probably only ever have 1 or 2 alerts registered, but we've got a number of alerts just to kind of show how it all fits together. We then have the flag system, and the flag system allows you to register that certain things have happened on the account, and they're typed, so you can have certain types of flags registered against an account. So you may have an over limit flag, or you may have a bounce check flag, and these are designed to be able to register that certain things have happened on the accounts and then drive business processes based on those. So you may set a flag against the account that says that the student bounced a check. You may then want to prevent checks from being used by that student for a certain period of time based on that flag. So flags are a very kind of simple hold-based system. We also integrate directly with the KS hold system, which is more of a student system-wide hold system that would allow you to register a hold that would affect another system, and would also allow you to read in holds from other systems that affect you. So for example, if we registered a student hasn't paid their account for 90 days type of hold, the registration system may then block that student from registering based on a KS hold. So you've got access to both flags which are internal to KSA and holds which are inside KSA and in other KS systems. We've got the payment billing system, which shows you that there are currently no payment billing plans attached to this student. That's the pie chart I showed you before. And then again, the third-party system, we've got our third-party hat, and there's no third-party payment plans registered against this student right now. The memo system, which is down here, allows you to record any information on a student that you need to be able to register as you go along. You can, as I said before, you can limit the memos to a certain group of users. And generally speaking, you can't edit memos because the information in the system really is supposedly like a permanent record. But you can expire memos and you can add follow-on memos. So example here, we have the student requesting a $200 charge to be locked, and then somebody replied to that saying that was approved. So if I go into the details for memos, you'll be able to see the memos in a slightly different view and expire them if you needed to. Memos can be expired, which means that they're still in the system but don't show on that quick view screen, so you can keep things a little cleaner. So for example, I can expire that memo right here. It'll automatically expire. So the expiration date's been set automatically. You've also got this little guy here, who is our audit guy. You'll see him around a lot in the system, and if you see that little guy, it means that there's audit information attached to that student, which means you can see who created it. You get the information straight from Kim as to how to contact that person if you need to contact them. You can also see if the information has been updated. So even though under most circumstances you wouldn't allow memos to be edited, you may give certain administrators the ability to edit memos to be able to clean something up. If that happened, you would be able to see who changed it, when it was changed, and if you really needed to, you could go back to the audit log and see what it was previously. You can apply a follow-up memo to the memo that you've seen, and you can get more information on the memo by clicking this link here. If I go back to Quick View now, you'll see this memo here was expired, so it won't show on the Quick View screen anymore. So even though the information is still there, you can remove it from view so it's not getting in the way and making the account untidy. You've obviously, within the system, you can create a memo manually, which just means that a student walked in and said something, so you recorded it. We also have the concept of mandatory memos. So there are certain things that you can do inside of KSA that even though the user may be authorized to do them, even though what they're doing is a completely legitimate action, you want to keep a record of why they did it. So there are certain times in KSA when a user does something where it says, okay, you can do this, but tell me why you're doing it, and the user's prompted to put in information about what they're doing. That's recorded as a memo on the account and on the transaction when they do something. We also have an automated memo system. So if the system does certain things, it will sometimes create a memo in the system too. So really a person looking at the account really knows what's going on in that account and knows why certain things have happened. Obviously, you've got some account overview information, what the past due balance is, what the current balance is, what the outstanding balance is, and then the age transaction list is also there. The aging system is on this student is a 30/60/90 system. That's not hard-coded into the system. You can set up as many aging processes as you want. That would allow you to, for example, on, say, one of your third-party sponsors, if I bring up that account uses a 90, 120, 150 day aging process. So that would mean that anytime you have any processes based on the age of the account, you could delay certain collections activities based on the account rather than just on the 30-day process. So for example, with IBM, you may not want to start bothering them with, hey, pay your accounts until they're at least 90 days late. Whereas with a student, you might want to make it 30 days late. You could do the same with a graduate student. You maybe want to make it 45 days late before they do things. So none of these things are hard-coded into the system. Let's go back to my user one. Obviously, up in the top left-hand corner, you've got the biographical information of the student. You can store multiple names, multiple addresses, multiple telephone numbers, multiple email addresses for a student. That information is directly pulled from Kuali Identity Management. If you have the system configured to push back to Kuali Identity Management, you would be able to change a student's address in the student accounts office, and that would be updated cross-campus. You're also able to set up accounts that only exist within KSA. So for example, you may want to just have an ad hoc account that doesn't go back to Kim, that isn't accessible from anywhere else, but you can put that information into the system. It's only held within KSA. So that's the overview for a student. We also have another couple of ways of looking at the account, obviously the more transaction-based view. So I'm going to switch to the roll-up based view of the student now. Rollups are a way of categorizing transactions so that instead of showing multiple transaction lines, you can roll them up to a single transaction line. So an example of that might be all of your course fees you may put into a rollup called course fees. So even though it's a music fee and a French fee and an MBA course fee, you may have 3 individual transactions on the account, but you might want to just roll it up to a single line that says course fees. On this student, again, you'll see that all our alerts and things are still registered on the top line. We can see that the student has these different rollups on their account. And if you drill into each of the rollups, you can see the individual transactions that make them up. So inside of undergraduate tuition charges, I think there's just one tuition charge of $10,000. But if there were several, they would all be rolled up to one line. You're also able to show transactions just within a given time frame. There's a few different ways of doing that. You can manually enter dates if that's what you need to do. You can pull this down and you can ask it to show you all transactions or last time the account had a 0 balance. So if you're working in a balance forward way, you can say to the system, okay, when was the student last paid off? I just want to know what's happened since they last paid off their account in full. And then this system also connects to KS's academic time period service, so you could set up fall 2013 and you'll be able to choose that from the pull down and it would get those dates from the time period service. You can also filter out the account by tags, which I'll show you in just one second. But this is a way of looking at the account that just kind of simplifies the view out. What's the student been charged in tuition? What have they been paid in financial aid? And so on. The more common way of looking at the account is in the running balance screen. And the running balance screen is a little bit more like the bank statements or a credit card statement view of a student's account. So I'll go through some of that detail when that comes up. It's basically a chronological list of the transactions on the account with a lot of information around those transactions. So again, you've got all the same filter options on an account. You can filter between certain dates, and then the list of transactions, which we'll look into now. We talked about payment application earlier on. And I mentioned the idea of locked and unlocked allocations. A locked is where you've made a manual allocation. And you'll see here that this study abroad charge has a locked allocation against it. What that means is this study abroad charge has been paid, and it's been paid by this cash payment of $50 earlier on. If I'd have allowed if I'd have allowed automatic payment application to work, it would have taken that $50 and applied it to tuition. Because the rules I have set up right now says that tuition is of a higher priority than study abroad charges. So that's been manually locked to make those two stick together. I can open up the study abroad charge and it will tell me what paid it off, which is that cash payment. I can also look at the cash payment and it will tell me that it's paying off the study abroad charge. And if I wanted to, I can remove that allocation and then reapply that cash somewhere else. Next to each one of these, you'll also see this little document link. The document is it's the idea that with a transaction you can store really non-accounting based data stored against a transaction. And it's just an open format for you to send other information about a transaction to KSA that can be then presented to the student. Because we don't have any external systems feeding into us right now, we've just mocked up something that you might do. So for example, your bookstore may send over its receipt to your system. So it might be very interesting that the student was charged $104, but what was that made up of? Obviously, your housing system could do something very similar. So anything that's sent to KSA could then be rendered on this view so that the student can see, or the user can see, what it is that's making up that transaction. So that's a document. These icons here are how you access the ability to do manual payment application. If I click that, it'll let me allocate payments to that charge. If I do the same for a charge, it will give me the payments I can allocate it to. This icon lets you reverse a transaction, which I'll show you in a little while. So instead of having to go into the system and issue a negative transaction and then allocate the two together, you can just reverse out a transaction. The system will take charge of producing the right transaction, negating it properly, doing the allocation for you, producing the right general ledger write-off, etc. On this transaction here, you'll see this little tag icon. I mentioned tags before. Tags are similar to rollups in that they're a way of categorizing transactions, but whereas a transaction can only be in one rollup, you can assign multiple tags to a transaction. So if I look at this little tag here, it tells me that it's a cash tag and it tells me it's a build 1098T tag. That's ways in which we can drive a lot of internal processes within KSA. So not only can you use it as a way of categorizing transactions, so you may have, for example, all of your scholarships or your financial aid in the system as one rollup. You could categorize those financial aid or those scholarships as private or state or departmental, and then you could filter them by tags. So a tag could be, you could have a tag in a transaction that says, this is a financial aid transaction, and it's a private financial aid transaction, and it's eligible to be reported to this federal agency. So it's a lot of different processes can be built off this tag process. It's also a good way for the user to look at the account and see, what that transaction really is based on. So tags are a really flexible way of categorizing things. It's a really good way of producing reports off the system because you can say, give me all transactions within this date and this date with this tag, and it can give you just that list of transactions instead of having to go in and write a query that says, I need these transaction types between these dates. It's a much simpler way of accessing the data in the system. On this transaction here, you'll see this little icon, which is a memo icon. The memo system I showed you before can be attached to accounts, and it can also be attached to a transaction. So if you do something strange to a transaction, you can attach a memo to that transaction so that if somebody's looking at the account, they can look at it and say, well, what happened here? Well, they can click on it and they can bring up the list of memos that are registered against that transaction. The other icon that you can see here is the refund icon. Again, it's not a usual thing that you would do an individual refund on an individual transaction, but anything that you can do in KSA as a batch operation, you can also do as an individual operation. So the system has decided that that transaction is refundable based on a lot of rules. If you click that, it will take you through the whole refunding process to actually get it to the point where a student could be issued a check for that outstanding balance. I'm going to add a couple of charges to this account just to show you a couple of different things about it. So again, probably not a very likely thing that you would do. Most of your charges will probably come from another system. But I'm going to add a charge to this, and I'm going to add a 1020 charge. And I'm going to charge the student $500 and put it onto their account. And the reason I'm showing you this is if I add another charge to the account, I'm going to add that same 1020 charge, but I'm going to make it 2 years ago. Because the transaction I just put on was a mistake. This was actually a charge from 2 years ago. Well, in the last 2 years, your rules may have changed a little bit. You may have changed what general ledger accounts things feed into. The charge that you're making may have changed its name. You may have changed your refund rules against the payments, anything like that. Our transaction identifier, the transaction type identifiers, your T codes or whatever you call them in your accounting system, inside KSA are actually versioned over time. So if you change, for example, if you have an award that changes its name, you don't have to come up with a different transaction code for that award. You can just change the transaction type. And the system's intelligent enough to pick the right transaction type based on the date of the transaction. So if I go back to my running balance view, remember I created 2 charges based on code 1020, and the only thing that was different about them was the date. But in that time, those 2 transaction types have changed. So the end user doesn't need to know that they've changed, they just need to know the right date for the transaction, and the system will intelligently pick the right transaction type for that time period. So I've got my $500 charge here that's called tuition 2013 onwards, but my original tuition charge is here, which is called tuition 2013. And even though all I've really done is change the name, any part of that accounting setup for that transaction type could have changed also, from your general ledger type to your priority to really anything that you store against the type of transaction, the tags it goes into, the rollup it goes into, can all be changed, versioned over time. Because this one was a mistake, I'm going to reverse this transaction off the system. Oops. This is an example of that mandatory memo system I was telling you about before, where I'm doing something that I'm allowed to do, but really I should be saying why I'm doing it. So, made a mistake, reapplied 2 years earlier. I'll reverse that transaction off the account. It automatically creates the memo to tell anybody else looking at the account why it was done. So you'll see that transaction was written off, negated automatically, the two have been locked together automatically, and there's a memo on this actual transaction saying what happened to it that would also show on the quick view for the student. So anybody looking at the account knows at a glance that that transaction was reversed, and that's why it was done. When you do a reversal on a transaction, we also have the idea of making a transaction what we called internal, which basically means on any view of the account, this doesn't have to be shown because it's just a negation. So you can mark certain reversals as internal, which means that anybody looking at the account, if it's just a full reversal, if it was an oopsie, you can make it so it disappears from the account. Obviously, because it's an accounting system, you can't just make transactions disappear. But the system can at least keep the account a little cleaner as anybody uses the account, doesn't need to see this double write-off of that transaction. On any transaction, you can click on the transaction and get a lot more information about it. So if I pull up this fee, it can get everything from what the identifier is. We store a lot of dates on the transaction, like when it was created, what the effective date is, the origination date of the transaction. So if your transactions come from an external system and they only come over once a week, you can see what day they were created in the original system before they hit your system. The recognition date, which is used in reference to the general ledger, the currency of the transaction. You can set up multiple currencies inside of KSA for information purposes. You can see that the general ledger transactions have been generated for this transaction. Basically, everything on the transaction can be viewed just by clicking on it in that way. If I go to, so that's a way of looking at the student account. From the administrative side of the system, I mentioned earlier on that everything inside of KSA is logged to an almost paranoid degree. So anything that changes in the system, we keep a log of. Let me see. So everything that we've done in the last few minutes, I know that it came from my IP address. It tells you when it happened. It tells you what was changed about it, and if there were previous values, what it changed from and to. So really, if anything happens in the system, you have a really good log of what happened, what changed, when it happened, who did it, if you need to look back at what's happened within the system. In the reporting and reconciliation system, which is our way of connecting to the general ledger. If I look at my pending transactions, this is where all the transactions that exist in KSA would also be sent out to the general ledger. And you can go from your general ledger batches and you can drill back to the original KSA transaction that produced that transaction. So at this point, it can show me what's sitting in the system waiting to be exported. I can look at batches that have previously been sent to the general ledger. I can take any general ledger activity and I can drill back to the original transaction that produced that general ledger account. So it's a really good way of auditing the system when you're trying to track down why a charge has gone through in a way that you didn't quite understand. In addition to being able to distribute your transactions in KSA to the general ledger, we can also distribute to multiple general ledger accounts. So you can make a transaction type code that does a 50-50 split to two different general ledger accounts, which really simplified a lot of the accountings at a couple of the schools that we've been working with on this project, because right now they're having to charge the student 5 different fees to produce a student fee. They can now charge one fee and then have that charge distribute to multiple different general ledger accounts. So it's a very powerful part of the system. If I look into the settings on the system, just a kind of like backdoor view of a lot of things going on in the system. I mentioned earlier on that basically most things inside of KSA, and in fact very few things in KSA are really kind of coded. Everything's done on what we call types or settings. So everything from the late period setup, which is a type, our transaction types, what currencies the system's going to work in, all a part of this settings screen. And so it's obviously all configurable by the end user at the point of deployment. So obviously the list of currencies it wants to use. If we look at the rollups that we saw before, these are the different rollups that I was currently using. The transaction types, which are the really big setup part of the system. When I showed you the transaction type before, that was a 1020, and it had two different versions. I can show you that in this transaction type setup screen. So we use the 1020, and you'll see that those are the two different versions of 1020 that go between these different dates going forwards. The third-party system can be used to take transactions off a student's account to another account. In this example, we have a student with no transactions on their account. I'm going to upload some transactions using our batch system. Transactions could equally come through another system, could come through fee management, could come through our web services, but I'm just uploading some using the OpenXML format that gives us a number of transactions on the student's account. The transactions are a group of tuition fees, bookstore fees, and so on. I already have a third-party system set up to be able to that defines limits and types of transactions that are allowed to be transferred to a third party, which account they're going to, what date the third party expects to be billed, and so on. Once we have the list of transactions, I can add that third party transaction account to this account. So I can come into the third party system. I'm going to add my example, add that plan, and I'm going to run it against the account. Obviously, in a system, normally this will be done by some kind of a batch process, but I'm going to execute that plan against this account. And you'll see that the transfer amount on the account is of $11,000. If I go back to the account now, we will see excuse me, a number of transactions have been transferred off to a third-party sponsor account. The plan allowed for up to $10,000 worth of tuition and then up to $1,000 worth of other types of fees at 50%. So we'll see now that the excuse me, the academic service fee has been paid off at 50%, the lab fee has been paid off at 50%, and then we have the actual transfers over to another account. We can even see which account they've gone to. So if I pull up the third-party account, our third party has been billed for those charges that went off the student account, and they can even see which student it was that they were billed for. If I return to the student's account, I can see my list of transactions. I can see the list of transfers that was made under a plan, showing me exactly what went to the other account. And if the plan is cancelled for some reason, I can remove that plan from the student's account. And all the transactions will be reversed off the student's account. The transactions that reverse those transactions are no longer showing. They are still on the account, but they've been marked as internal. This is done to make the account seem tidier. But if you need to see those transactions to see exactly what happened at the account, they can be shown just by clicking the Show Internal Transactions. That can be done to any number of reversal transactions. Generally speaking, if you reverse a transaction in its entirety, it can be marked as internal so that it doesn't show on the student's account. But as you can see, all the transactions that we created and the reversals are still on the account for audit purposes.